So I know we've done this before, but still, like, can you introduce yourself, a little bit of your background and where you came from?
Yeah, so name's Joseph Coyne, PhD from Edith Cowan University, which is actually in Perth, Australia. But I grew up in New Zealand. New Zealand went to university in New Zealand, Otago University, and then also did a graduate diploma of teaching at a place called the Dunedin College of Education. That was way back in 2005. Then came over to Australia and started working essentially in the performance space in Australia since then, mainly with uh, sprinters, beach sprinters, surf lifesavers, triathletes, swimmers to start with. Then from there, I actually did my master's degree in research on swimming, the effects of upper body strength on swimming paddle speed, and uh, ended up getting a job in China. Actually, I was originally supposed to go across to China for track and field, a job with the Track and Field Federation. That didn't come off, but I ended up getting a job with their Olympic Committee through EXOS, or Athletes Performance, as I called them. So I went over there. That was about 18 months. And then at the end of that, I switched over to the Track and Field Federation after that 18 months. And that was sort of Rio Olympics, 2017 World Championships, 2015 World Championships in athletics, and really loved my time in athletics. Came back to Australia after that. I'd had some kids, or had a kid, and so it was pretty hard for family life, coaching in China, and uh, and also looking after the family and being there for the family. So I came home to Australia. I'd started my PhD by then, and then I got an offer to go back to China again. This time I brought my family, but it was with the UFC, and I was the director of the Performance Institute at the UFC in Shanghai for 2 years. But it was really COVID interrupted, and now I'm back in Australia. I work for Bond University and the high school called Lindisfarne Anglican Grammar, um, which are basically in my hometown. So great situation, and that's basically a real quick fire, rapid slingshot introduction of myself.
Nice, nice to hear that. So, um, the first question I want to ask is about like sprinting. I know there's like you work with like different sprint coaches and talk with a lot of like great sprint coaches, and you also work a little bit about sprinting. So when it comes to like training, like let's say like 100-meter sprinter, can you explain about like your thoughts on the weekly layout? Like let's say some of the guys would do like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. What about your thoughts on like when should they do like maximum sprint, maximum velocity, and acceleration?
Mm. So a lot of the typical track and field model is a high day, low day alternation over 6 days of the week, Sunday off. So it might be Monday, low day. You come in, you do some tempo work, you do some activation work, maybe something snappy in the gym. Then Tuesday, you might do acceleration, followed by very heavy weights. Wednesday, same as Monday. Thursday, maximal velocity work, followed by some more powerful weights. Friday, same as Monday and Wednesday, and then Saturday, speed endurance work. But it might be speed endurance work, it might be special endurance work, it might be intensive tempo, it might be hills. All depends on the stage of the season. But that's a real common weekly outline for track and field. That can obviously change depending on the athlete and their experience. So more advanced athletes, more experienced athletes might have things tighter and more closely together. So, for instance, Dan Paff, his sort of microcycles, 7-day microcycles, have a lot more work in them than that. It'd be quite similar to, say, Stu McMillan's microcycle. But in general, it's a high day, low day alternation.
Nice. So, when it comes to like so periodization of the speed training, let's say you have like a meet on probably like 2 weeks or 4 weeks afterwards. How would you like program the training, or when do you start like tapering?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I think this is really individual, but in general, at least 10 days prior. you want to start tapering. Charlie Francis is a famous 10-day taper going into sprint meets, and it's available online. You can find it, really easy to find. But yeah, in general, you want to start tapering at least 10 days prior. Some athletes will like doing a little something the day before. Some athletes don't like that. Some athletes like doing nothing the day before. But in my experience, what we would do is we'd always have some type of basically everything revolved for the big competitions on a 4-day lead-in. You would have tapering prior to that, and the taper might have even been 2 months prior in terms of pulling back the overall workload and making sure people are really fresh, especially for things like the Olympics and so on. But in the 4-day sort of cycle is also really important prior to major events. So it might be travel to 4 days out and then do a warm-up, or 3 days out and then do a warm-up. Then on the -2, so the 2 days out from the event, full rest. -1, it's like some priming. There might be something in the weight room to be a warm-up. Depending on the person, what they like, maybe it's some medicine ball work, like power medicine ball work. Maybe it's something a little bit resisted with sprinting. Maybe it's in the weight room doing something like cleans or jumps with a barbell, that type of thing. And there's ways you can set this up for priming and then compete the following day. I've also seen situations where you might do something prior on the morning before a night competition. That's really, really important as well. And that just revolves around what that person prefers. So if a person likes resting on the day before, then you might do something in the morning to prime them on that evening. The person might like doing their priming the day before, then they might rest in the morning and only have some really light activity. It's actually really good to do some activity the morning of an event, but it doesn't always need to be a priming thing. Just even being active and getting a very light sweat will do things hormonally, increase testosterone as a main function. You can even use blood flow restriction on the morning to get acute increases in testosterone for a later competition on the same day.
Nice. So I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into this. Like when I talk to Coach Boo Boo Schexnayder, there's 3-day cycle, and I heard from the podcast Randy did with Joel Smith, there's 3-day cycle and 4-day cycle. And I know you worked with Randy before, so can you give us your thoughts on what if there's a 3-day cycle and how would you work on that?
A 3-day microcycle,
Yeah.
or 3 days before competition.
3-day microcycle. Sorry about that.
3-day microcycle. So when I worked with Randy, we didn't use a 3-day microcycle. We used a 4-day microcycle, but the fourth only in some instances. And that instance was basically because it was for long jump only at the time. The fourth day was the rest day, and then the cycle carried on. So basically from memory, and I'd have to go back to my notes and double check this, but from memory, there was a acceleration or approach day, a tempo day, then a jumping day, and maximum velocity sprinting day. So, sorry, it went like this. Approaches, maximum velocity, tempo day, and then jumping day, along with potentially some acceleration, things like that, and then day off from that. So there was a 4-day microcycle that they cycled through. From memory, that might have been before 2015 World Champs.
Nice. So that works for long jumpers. So what if we're going to discuss about sprinters?
Sprinting, acceleration day 1, max weights, day 2 tempo, day 3 maximum velocity, power weights, day 4 rest.
And it goes on.
That would be the seal. Yeah, and then it just rotates through. So you might go Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, cycle 1. Next cycle, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, cycle 2. Next cycle, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, cycle 3. But there might be changed too. Instead of depending on the person's strengths or weaknesses, it might be max velocity day 1, and then speed endurance day 3. Just depending on the athlete's strengths and weaknesses, you could work it like that. in that setup.
Cool. So kind of go back to like the 10-day tapering, that kind of stuff. So for those 10 days, how like for volume wise or like intensity wise, how like how is it for the intensity? Are you gonna go higher and the volume? How low would you like probably go to?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and there's lots of different ideas in the space. In general, the rules of tapering, you keep the intensity the same, you keep the frequency the same, but you drop the volume. So that means those are just the general rules of thumb. I've seen heaps of successful people dropping frequency as well, and you can actually change the neurological stimulus can stay the same, but you can change the actual local target. So, for instance, Charlie Francis might use something like bench press in that period to keep a neurological stimulus or nervous system stimulus going on without muscularly fatiguing the legs in that taper period. So there are those options as well that you might use in those in any taper. But the general rules are you keep intensity high, you keep your frequency the same, or you keep intensity the same as what you've been leading into, but the volume drops away considerably. And then I've also seen coaches play around with frequency as well, and very successfully, where instead of say day on, day off, day on, it might be day on, day off, day off, day on, in terms of like training. So it might be some type of work, then tempo and recovery, core, that type of thing, then day off, then repeat that. So that's like a little 3-day cycle you might want to use to get athletes freshened up.
Like that, love that. I'm sorry that I asked a lot of like big question, and I know the answer is always like it depends, but thank you for answering all those questions.
No problem. No problem. No, it's
So
really good for the practical examples. I love talking weekly setups and ways you can manipulate things going into competition. Yeah, it's a real interest area of mine.
appreciate it, man. So next thing I want to discuss is uh the things that you post on Instagram when you work with Randy and you work with Sue. So or like the chat team over there. I saw like there's a lot of like step up variations and some of like single leg RDL, but not like it's not like what we used to see. There's a little bit difference. So can you discuss at like what your thoughts on like designing these movement and why should sh- on like your thoughts on like athletes should be doing like single leg work and in what situation they should do like bilateral work.
Okay. So I'm in locomotion. It's unilateral. And for instance, when you're running, there is one leg is contacting the ground, then you float a bit, and then the other leg contacts the ground. And walking, both legs will contact the ground at the same time. So to do that, it only makes sense that you need to have some unilateral loading in your programs. I love the step up for unilateral loading, and there's a lot of different variations. There's a high step up, low step up. There's contact to the box. There's intermittent contact on the box. There's constant contact on the box with step ups. There's backloading with dumbbells. With barbells, and there's all sorts of variations. I really like the step ups for any type of locomotive athlete, whether it's a field sport athlete, a track sprinter, anybody that needs to run. Okay, a court sport athlete would get benefits out of it, and even just in general for any athlete that wants to improve their lower body strength, there are benefits for using the step up. On my max strength days, and I'd normally program according to max strength day and a power day. On my max strength days, I would use a low box step up. So this might be 15, 20 centimeters. And my general rule of thumb is I'd want athletes to work up to 2.5 to 3 times their body weight in that movement. This can be an intermittent contact, so where they actually make contact, go bang, bang each time. If it gets really heavy, sometimes they just stay constant contact. On the power days, I like to use a high box step up, where the athletes might step up with weight on their back onto the box nice and fast, and it's a bit of more power theme, and they might bring the other leg back up into that classic A position, you might call it. That might happen with my high box step ups. It won't happen with my low box step ups, just for the reason that the load generally gets too heavy for that.
Nice. So, like, for like track and field athlete, in what situation you're gonna be doing like bilateral strength training?
So there will always be something bilateral for the track athletes, especially sprinters. Sprinters need to start out of bilateral force expression. Same with swimmers on the blocks, sprinters on the blocks. So yeah, there'll always be some bilateral force work going on there. So yeah, there'll generally be maybe on the power day, it might be a power clean and a high box step up, and then you've got bilateral and unilateral. And on the max strength day, it might be a squat, Kaiser squat, something like that, and a low box step up might be your options. There are actually methods that you can determine whether you need to do more of or less of a bilateral unilateral work. So I sometimes use the bilateral deficit to figure this out, but it's one of the things. The bilateral deficit is unique to an athlete's to different exercises. So, for instance, the bilateral deficit in, say, a leg press or a squat may be different to the bilateral deficit in a jump. So I always base things off jumping, and if their bilateral deficit is very low, so that means the sum of their left plus right divided by both at the same time is very close to one another, then I might do that. That's a case where you might say, we need more unilateral work, especially if it's a unilateral task you want to improve. However, so that's just in general. Then you can modulate that based on what you want to improve. Say you want to improve a person's start. That's a bilateral task. Your aim would actually to be bringing down their bilateral deficit. Okay. Remember, bilateral deficit is left plus right divided by two legs at the same time, or the bilateral. So unilateral left, unilateral right divided by bilateral. So that it's in a start, which is a bilateral focus, you might try to bring down your bilateral deficit. However, if the person needed to maybe improve maximum velocity sprinting or even change the direction in a field sport, you might try, which is a unilateral task, you might try to bring up the bilateral deficit so that relative to the bilateral exercise, say 2-leg counter movement jump, their left leg counter movement jump and their right leg counter movement jump is much greater than the 2 legs. So those are ways you can play around with it. And all of those things are suggested in the research, that those differences in bilateral deficit is advantageous for those different tasks.
Nice, nice. So in the state for like the team sport athlete, recently they were like using like more unilateral strength training because they think that uh there's probably like too much load on the spine when they do like bilateral like lifts. So can you give us like some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it just depends on the athlete. If they've got discogenic issues in the spine, if they've got actual spine issues, there's nothing wrong with loading your legs unilateral. And there are bilateral options that you can use that do not load the spine. For instance, a belt squat. For instance, a leg press would be other options where you don't have the axial load on the spine. If you still wanted to get a bilateral load through the legs, you could use. There's many other options you could use. So even a safety bar squat will change the load going through the spine compared to a barbell, because now the center of mass is a little bit lower. It's not as high, so there's a little bit less shear force going through the spine. So all those options are there, and it depends on the athlete. But the main thing is you've always got to remember, you want to be making the athlete better at their sport. And use whatever you need to do that. If it's a rear foot elevated split squat, if it's a leg press, if it's a single leg press, find what you need to make them better at their sport, and it doesn't matter what exercise you use to do so.
So, when I heard the podcast you did with like Rob Pacey, and you just talk about like working back from the sport. So can you like this explain a little bit about what exactly is working back from the sport?
So in the sport an athlete plays, you identify what you can have influence on. Say if it's track and field, it's really easy. And even as a coach, as a technical coach, or say strength and conditioning coach, you want to work back from the sport. What do they need to be good at? Okay, what does winning a gold medal look like in the Olympics? How is that broken down? What is the stride length? What is the stride frequency? Okay, where are we at now? Where do we need to get to? What are the biggest gaps? Okay, what are the interventions we can use now on those parameters to try and improve those gaps, try and lessen those gaps? So you can be really targeted. So for instance, for contact time, say if contact time was an issue with an athlete, you might use some type of plyometric intervention, really focusing on contact time to help that athlete. And of course, you've got to monitor and measure as you go along to actually see if it is improving the task you want to improve in the sport. If it's not, you need to change tact and find something else to do. For instance, it might be, say, contact time. It might be improving ankle stiffness is one of the goals, the actual structural goals. And you might find the low contact or low contact time plyometrics aren't doing that. Then you might, okay, let's take another step. Let's go and focus on maybe maximal strength in the ankle. So it might be a seated calf you might try next. And that seated calf might be the actual intervention that's working. So it's just like a grand experiment. You've got to figure out what way you want to go with it, but you should always work back from the sport that you're working with and understand what are the actual performance parameters of that sport. And know, okay, if I improve this, it should help him do that better. And then focus all your energy on those tasks.
Nice, nice. Love that. So let's say what if I'm training a like 100-meter sprinter, and at the end of like the 30 meters, the athletes kind of lack of like the core like or the motor control to maintain the high speed coordination. So what exactly besides like Charlie Francis like short to long approach, is there any other like methods for you to like train the motor control, like train the neuromuscular like motor control and coordination? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. So if it's coordination, there's a number of different ways to do that. And say just in this instance, and I assume what you're saying is they're having difficulty kind of transitioning from an acceleration to maximum velocity. So there's a number of different drills, running drills you might be able to use, different ways of loading the athlete, e.g. with a stick on their back, with a stick overhead to help improve coordination, with micro loading the appendages, so with wrist weights, with ankle weights. All those things serve as a skill acquisition tool for the athletes to improve and to understand how to move their body in time and space and to get into the correct shapes. So from there, those would be my main tools in that situation, especially if it's a coordination aspect and not an actual physical output aspect. E.g., they've got the engine, but they don't have the software. You need to work on the software.
Nice, nice. So next thing I want to discuss is about like management. So when you work with like team sport athlete, you work with swimmer, or when you work with like rugby athletes, how exactly do you manage those load and to like cooperate with the strength training or the weight training you do in the gym?
Yeah, this is actually the topic of my PhD, right? So training load, it's in general, you don't want to exceed the average of what you've done in the last 4 weeks within 1 week. So acute to chronic workload ratio, training stress balance, you call it a number of different things. That's just the general rule of thumb. Coaches have known about that for years. if sometimes you'll get athletes that have been off for, now actually I'll take a step back, that those ratios, they're not set in stone, and a lot of things influence us. So people have genetic components which enable them to handle much greater increases in training volume or much greater increases in training intensity than other athletes. Also, your previous level or your history as an athlete will dictate what you can get up to. So say, for instance, I'll just give you an example. You've never had an athlete that's done high day, low day, high day, low day, high day, low day in sprinting or track and field. Maybe they're a high school athlete coming to you. They might not be able to handle that. And you'll need to step by step, maybe it's 5% increases to get there, 10% increases to get there each week for you to get them to that. Versus you might have an athlete that's done that for 3 years, then they go on break for, 4 months, and they come back and see you. They might be able to slot straight back into that high day, low day without issue, just because of their years of experience in that system. So there's those sort of caveats to it. But in essence, you want to be monitoring what you've done over the last 3 to 4 weeks and compare that to what you're doing this week to make sure the jump or the change is not too great. And you can also use that same tool for your tapers to make sure that you're actually reducing the load, the combined load of volume and intensity, because it's really common for coaches to drop the volume out, but then actually raise the intensity. And that it means that the taper doesn't even become a taper. It essentially just stays the same as the regular training, and the athletes don't perform well. They're not rested. So having an understanding of that and having an understanding of how you can actually measure those things and that training volume and intensity, it becomes vital and critical, especially if you want to do well on a world stage.
Nice. So do you, when it comes to like load management, do you like any certain like method to like collect some data about it?
Yeah. So there's essentially two parts. There's internal load and external load. And there's different ways of measuring those constructs. Internal load is how you respond to the actual training. The external load is the actual training you complete, the mechanical work you do. The internal load, the main two that people will use will be heart rate and sessional ratings of perceived exertion, SRPE. SRPE is the most usable. Although if you are, especially if you're a team sport athlete or a power athlete, if you are a endurance athlete, and maybe some other team sport athletes, definitely heart rate is also very applicable, and heart rate might be your dominant measure. And external training load will be something like the distance covered, the speed that you actually did, and now it's very common for that to be based off GPS or accelerometry. To give athletes, even now in sprinting, we're moving more and more in track and field, moving more and more to that sort of the mini-maxes, catapult mini-max devices, GPS devices. And that's been a really cool shift I've seen in track and field.
Right. So I heard a lot like coaches work with pro setting. They use like session RPE. So can you like explain to us how this like session RPE works?
All right. How long do we have? So session RPE is like a 1 to 10 scale. It's not a linear scale. It's an exponential scale. So 5 is not moderate. 5 is hard. 3 is moderate. It's really important to understand that because the harder the things you do, the harder you train, the more impact it has. It's an exponential impact on your recovery and the time for you to be able to train next. So for instance, if I do something that's, moderate, 50% of my max effort, okay, versus I do something that's like 90% of my max effort, I might need to recover. I might not need any recovery out of 50% of my max effort, but I might need 2 or 3 days to recover after 90% of my max effort. So that's the real key with SRPE. And there's a few other things about collecting SRPE scores in terms of making sure they're valid when you're collecting them. In regards to anchoring, what's 0, what's 10, and making sure athletes understand that. There's a thing we can do called a blackness test, which helps people get better at rating these their perceived exertion. from there, once that it's rated, and you also have to rate the verbal anchors first. So, for instance, there's verbal anchors on these SRP charts, even though there's numbers. You should almost, I'm a fan of numerically blinded RPE. Okay, so there's no numbers, it's just the verbal anchors. Athletes tell you how they're feeling, then you correspond that to the number. Because everybody's brain always gets mixed up with the whole linear scale where they just feel like 5 should be moderate and hard would be something like a 7 or 8. So numerically blinded scales, they're a big thing. I'm a big fan of them. From there, you can then multiply that rating by either the total distance you do in the session. Normally, it's the total amount of time in the session. And I have to say, it's very important. There's a lot of mistakes that have been made in the research and by practitioners to make sure that athletes are rating the intensity of the session. So that's the average intensity of the session, not how hard was the session. How hard was the average intensity of the session? Because if you just say how hard was the session, the actual duration of the session will impact that a lot. It might be a very long session, but the average intensity might be quite low. Or it might be a very long session, but the average intensity might be moderate. It might be a very short session, but the average intensity might be very high. So you have to make sure they're rating the intensity and not the volume or the duration of the session. Because then what you do, you take that SRP number and you multiply it by the duration of the session or the distance they travel in the session. So it's common in swimming, they might multiply it by the distance they travel. And you can do this also with running as well. And cycling, you could do it with any one of those sports you could do it with. And so that product of that, the volume and intensity, then becomes your training impulse for the day. And that's what you can use to monitor your this balance between what you've done in the last microcycle compared to the last 2 to 3 microcycles or 4
So
microcycles.
when you said that the average intensity multiplied by the session duration, is it like minute or like
Yeah,
second?
in minutes normally. Yeah.
And add to the total volume like strength work, right?
Yeah, so for strength work, you can actually do it differently. You could also do that. You could give an SRPE times the amount of reps for strength work. Okay. So for instance, you might do, I don't know, 60 reps in your session, and you might multiply that by the SRP. More common in weightlifting or strength conditioning, or strength, I should say, strength training, is for you to do sets by reps by weight, okay, as a volume load. That's another way you could do it. Your sets by reps is your volume, and the actual weight is your intensity factor. And that can be expressed as a total weight, or can be expressed as a percentage of your 1RM.
So do you like add these together, these session RP for the like let's say no matter swim training or like rugby training and add the load volume with the weight training? Do you add it together or just
The only way you can add them together is if you use one common intensity factor or rating across all the different modes of training. The only way you can do that, you can do it with heart rate, but it fails when you get into intermittent activities like weightlifting, like sprinting, all that type of thing. The only way you can do that is with sessional RPE.
nice, nice, nice. Love that.
And then what I generally do is there will be a non-technical component to everything, which might be your strength conditioning, anything that's not the actual training for the sport or outside of what they'll be doing in the sport. And then there's a technical component. And then that's how I break up my load management.
Love that. Love that. I used to like discuss with a lot of like strength coaches or like performance coaches in the pro team and discuss pro settings. I'm sorry, to discuss like how they manage the load, and they often brought up like session RP and how they use it. But when it comes to like combine it into like weight training, when they use like when they try to manage the load in the, let's say, basketball training, they use session RP, but when it comes to like load management, they just use like how much weight and multiple by reps and like set, and they just add together. It like just for all those times, it just kind of doesn't make sense for me.
Yeah, no, it's you can get a factor. You can use your SRPE to kind of give you what is apples to apples in the technical and non-technical training. So you can then compare if you're only using external load, but SRPE would be the common factor. And even then, that is actually fraught with danger. To do it correctly, you need SRPE in all your activities. And to be honest, if I'm working with a group that doesn't record SRPE in the technical training, it's rare that I'll actually use it in the non-technical, like strength conditioning, just because you need an overall picture of the stress that's being applied to an athlete. And you're better off going, oh, for me, I'm experienced enough where I can go off what I'm seeing and what the amount and the time and the duration, what I'm seeing in the weight room. And it's not much use if you're only doing it piecemeal, in my opinion. It should be applied across all facets if you are going to use it.
Cool, cool, cool. So I'm gonna switch the topic to like the experience you work with like UFC. Okay.
Okay.
So when it comes like working with the UFC, there's a lot of like rotational movement. So can you discuss about a little bit about like the sequence of like the rotation?
Yeah, so for the UFC, I actually didn't do much practical work with the athletes. We had strength conditioning coaches that worked with them, and I helped coordinate those coaches and manage those coaches. But besides that disclaimer that the rotational work is the same as a throw, essentially throwing a punch is very similar to throwing an implement. Kicks are again similar, but there's force transmitted into the floor to generate rotation, and there's rotation around the axes of the body. And so athletes need to be able to move in multiplanar arrangements, and they need to be able to produce force into the floor. So it's no coincidence that a lot of punching power is correlated with lower body strength and lower body power. And kicking power obviously is correlated with lower body strength and power, even in your sagittal plane movements like a squat or deadlift.
Nice. So does the strength training work for like those boxers or like those uh yeah, boxers? It's kind of the same with when you work with a track and field athlete, or is it different?
I mean, the strength training focuses might be slightly different, and they'll generally not get up to the same levels of lower body strength as a track athlete or field athlete, because there's more. It's not as specialized their event, and they have to cover more bases. They have to have more endurance and a few other things. But and there will also be a lot more upper body work with we'll say an MMA fighter.
So
But the strength work definitely helps them. The strength work definitely helps them.
yeah. So I know we work with tons of like athletes and like different sports. So for a performance coach who just graduated or who just finished their like let's say their master like PhD, is there like uh some recommendation or like some advice for these young coaches?
So my advice, this is what I actually did. And I think it's very, very important practically. Go and train gymnastics, adult gymnastics for a year. Gymnastics is like the grandmother of performance coaching, strength conditioning. Go and coach, go and compete in weightlifting for a year. Okay, go and be an athlete in weightlifting yourself for a year. weightlifting is like the grandfather of strength and conditioning. Okay. Then go and compete in track and field for a year. Okay. Track and field might be the grand uncle, okay, of strength and conditioning and performance coaching. So once you've done that, that's 3 years practical experience. Once you've done that, you'll understand leverage. You'll understand training concepts. You'll understand so many things that you won't get out of a university degree. So those would be my recommendations for sure.
I love this. I love this because for my own, when I started my career, I actually like learned Olympic weightlifting for he used to be on the national team for weightlifting. I worked with him like for like a year and a half, and now I'm working with a track coach also for a year and a half. But probably gonna start working with gymnastics.
Yeah, go and do adult gymnastics. You'll learn so much, especially upper body strength, upper body pulling, wrist preparation, ankle preparation, flexibility. You'll learn a lot.
Yeah, appreciate for the time, man. So for those coaches who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you? And I know last time you brought this up, but still, I know you have like education for like sprinting, for like speed training. Is there going to be an upcoming event? Where can they find this?
So yeah, no events planned as yet, but if people want to check it out, it's HIT Science, HIIT Science.com. There's a developing maximal sprinting speed course that I've put together in conjunction with Martin Boucher and also Paul Larson, who managed that HIT Science portfolio. So that's a great course right then and there. And highly recommended. So 100% I'll jump on that. People are really interested in it. I can probably organize a discount code or something like that if you get in touch. And then look, if you want to get in touch, I'm on your sort of social medias at Joseph Coyne on Twitter and Instagram. And that's probably the easiest way.
Nice. Appreciate it, man.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric.